Hi guys, welcome to lecture 6 for digestion. I know the lectures for the digestive tract, like the digestive tract, are long and prolonged. Anyway, we've left the stomach behind, and we talked about the accessory organs that dump their juice into the duodenum. That's the first part of the small intestine. So today we're going to look a little bit about where really the action's happening in the small intestine. And the small intestine, like I said, is found. What's the anatomical term we use to describe things below? Maybe posterior to? Nah, it's not superior. Inferior to the stomach. And it's got three major sections: the duodenum, that's right next to the stomach; the jejunum, and then last but not least is the ileum, right? And so it's the duodenum, jejunum, and ileum, and those different regions have different internal topography with different functions. Talk a little bit about that. You can see in the diagram to the right here, or to the left, I have this other important organ called the mesentery, which is this layer of connective tissue with fat, and we'll talk about some of those functions. And of course, once we get out of the small intestine, we move to the cecum or large intestine. So let's talk about this tube within a tube body plan and the wall of the small intestine. Okay, so the wall of the small intestine is covered in these extensions of, there's ridges in there, but there's also these extensions called villi. So there's structures called circular folds. So the interior of the tube kind of looks like one of those flex tubes, maybe something you'd seen on a vacuum, with these circular folds. And then covering the interior epithelium, you have villi. These are finger-like extensions. Remember, we've had similar terminology to talk about extension. Remember, there's the dermal papillae. Villi are these multiple finger-like extensions that are the functional unit, so to speak, for the interior of the small intestine. Now, they are made up of simple epithelium. It's unusual, though, in the sense that the internal cuboidal cells, or columnar, I believe they are, also have these extensions called microvilli. So I have the villi, which are the finger-like extensions, and then on the cells themselves, I have microvilli. Again, remember the theme in anatomy is to increase surfaces, which are where exchange occurs. And of course, the big role of the small intestine is to absorb nutrients. So the bigger the surface area, the better. Note that each villus has a lymph gland, or a lymph extension called a lacteal. It's a lacteal, and this lacteal is surrounded by a venous capillary and arterial capillary. Okay, so blood's going to come in through the artery, pick up nutrients, deliver oxygen to these tissues, but absorb a bunch of stuff. Now remember, we're right down in the guts. There's lots of bad guys in the guts, and so that lymphatic vessel is also carrying white blood cells. So remember, circular folds, villi, and then the cells that make up these villi are covered with cells that have microvilli, further extending these surface area of the tissue. So the guts are actually attached to the posterior abdominal wall through this thing called the mesentery. It's this big, highly vascularized serous membrane, and it's got some cool roles. I think that the role of the mesentery becomes, like everything in anatomy and physiology, better understood over time. But it's got some important roles in vitamin storage. It's got important roles. In fact, if you have like chronic inflammatory bowel disease, you'll see that the mesentery becomes, bigger. People who are obese tend to lay fat down in the mesentery, and it seems like it it sort of acts as a positive feedback loop. So not only does the mesentery store, triacylglycerides and vitamins, but it also has a hormonal role. And I think I recollect that the mesentery is involved in the production of a hormone called leptin, which is associated with regulating hunger. So once again, here's the organizational features. We have these circular folds, villi. The villi have the lacteal with capillaries. And then when I take a look at this, remember this is a mucous membrane, so it's covered in goblet cells. And then each of those individual cells has microvillus. And we call this very diffuse extension here, this feathery stuff, the brush border. So remember that the small intestine is about 20 feet long, and each villus is about 0.5 millimeter in length, and then and you got a lot of them, over 20 feet. There it is, circular folds, lacteal, capillaries, villus, covered with cells that have microvilli to make up the brush border. All right, so what's going on down there? Well, remember that all kinds of enzymes have been secreted by the accessory organs. There's enzymes that have been secreted into the chyme in the stomach, even in the salivary glands. But this addition of chemical catalysts, biological catalysts, and goes on. And so we have a boatload of other enzymes, and I'll try to highlight in the vocabulary reviews which enzymes I expect you to. But you should know that a peptide, obviously is an enzyme that attacks peptide bonds, right? So it breaks down amino acids. A sucrase obviously is going to be attacking sucrose, maltase, maltose, lactase, lactose. And of course, these guys are disaccharides, so they can be broken down. Lipases are, we're going to break down fats. An enterokinase. Okay, so entero means guts, kinase means movement, and so the enterokinases are going to convert trypsinogen into trypsin. I don't know if you remember, but trypsinogen was one of the secretions in pancreatic juice. Somatostatin is another hormone. So this somatostatin affects the secretions of insulin and glucagon, but it also inhibits acid secretion. Cholecystokinin, remember, a cholecystectomy is the removal of a gallbladder. Chole means bladder. Cyst means bladder. Chole refers to colic, the gallbladder. And CCK does what? Kinin moves the gallbladder. What else? And then last but not least, we have secretin. So remember that the secretin was the hormone that was in the feedback loop for pancreatic juice release. So remember that mucus is constantly being secreted. It's a big mucous membrane, and then remember that the smooth muscle that surrounds the small intestine is going to respond to stretching. So if it's distended, you're going to have a release of hormones, and you're going to have contractions in response. So what's being absorbed in the small intestine? Amino acids, monosaccharides, right? I have to break these larger biochemical compounds down into their smaller constituents, right? So proteins are broken into amino acids, polysaccharides into the monosaccharides, and then, of course, additionally, all kinds of electrolytes and water are going to be absorbed through diffusion, osmosis, and active transport, and then fatty acids and glycerol are going to be absorbed into the lymph and the blood vessels. I don't know why they make this differentiation here, but let's see. Fatty acids are used to synthesize endoplasmic reticulum. All right, so you're going to absorb stuff, and that's going to be used up right in those cells. One of the things that's true, and I showed you that video or the photograph of someone with hypercholesteremia, high blood glucose level. Remember that that what you're actually seeing are these suspended particles called chylomicrons, all right? So when you take in fats, you package them into these things called chylomicrons, and they're going to enter the bloodstream here. Remember, these blood vessels and these lymph vessels are all going to feed that hepatic portal vein because they're taking food off to the liver to be, processed to take sugars out, take toxins out, etc. So there you go. So chylomicrons are leaving these cells to enter the lymph gland, the lacteal, and that's where we transport fats. Interesting. Maybe we'll come back to chylomicrons later. So in the GI tract, in the esophagus, we have peristalsis, right? This is simple pushing movements, and in the stomach, we have all kinds of like gesticulations because of the arrangements of things. Well, these rings in the small intestine cause a process called segmentation. So it kind of moves stuff back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, eventually all moving down. All right. And of course, if I overstretch this wall, you can have trigger a dumping syndrome, which we'll talk about in our unit on the large intestine. When you think about diseases of the small intestine, you think about things like IBS, irritable or inflammatory bowel disease, or Crohn's disease, and celiac disease. And you can see they can differentially affect different parts of the guts, all right? So celiac is largely associated with the small intestine, whereas Crohn's can affect both small and large intestine, and ulcerative colitis will affect the large intestine almost exclusively. However, they're all sort of this process where the immune system overreacts to the things that you're taking in. So let's talk about celiac disease that's happening in the small intestine. This is largely the result of eosinophilic response to gluten, and some other proteins. But in short, you have an immune response here whenever you digest this stuff, and the immune cells, in the end of over time, will start to break down the structures of the villi. And once those villi are broken down over time, then your ability to absorb nutrients is affected. You end up with anemia. I would say there's probably a growing consensus that autoimmune disease in one area tends to precipitate autoimmune disease in other places. So classic symptoms for these diseases are going to be digestive issues, diarrhea, discomfort, heartburn, bloating, gas, etc. And so if you're somebody that suffers from one of these things, there's actually pretty good treatments now. So remember that autoimmune diseases are being treated today by this whole new class of biological medications called the biologics, and they include these synthesized interleukins, or immunoglobulins that they can inject into, and you get your injection once every 3 months, and a bunch of your symptoms go away, and you start to lead a relatively normal life. Okay, well that's it for today, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.